I've been recording my readings of this book, Propaganda, so that I can listen to it later because it's so dense that even though I'm getting tons of ideas and picking up tons of things while reading it, I know that you could take probably any paragraph and unpack it in a very full way. But one part that I was reading tonight was about the timeliness of propaganda, and that the necessity to always be focused on the thing that's happening right now is an integral part of the propaganda form of communication. Byrne Power is the one that first, mentioned this book, and he's written quite a bit on it on his blog and talked about it in his videos, and he's talked about this kind of knee-jerk reaction.
Well, you know what a knee-jerk is. Knee-jerk is you go to the doctor, they want to test your reflexes, so they put your knee so it kind of hangs over a bench, and then they come with a little rubber hammer, and they hit just a certain spot right on your knee where there's a bit of cartilage, and boom, your knee, if you're in good shape, your knee goes. And it just, you can't stop it. And they look at that, and the doctors are always like, that's a good thing. So what's important, though, is that when your knee jerks physically, that's a good thing. But emotionally, politically, theologically, when your knee jerks, that's a terrible thing. What do I mean? It means you don't even have a governor to prevent an overreaction. You just simply hear a word and react. And it's often a word. Sometimes it'll just be someone's name, like Trump or Macron or Putin or Merkel or Obama or Clinton. Or you'll hear a concept, a Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, feminism, Muslim, Christian, or God, the devil, or a company name. You hear McDonald's and you're like, whoa. You hear Apple and you're like, oh, these sorts of things. Starbucks, oh my God. We hear these words and people just have some sort of immediate reaction.
You're reacting to it. And in the thought of the timeliness, even though I'm not really focusing on mainstream news or anything like that at the moment, there is just, even on YouTube, this thing to always want to react to the thing that's coming out right now and the thing that's coming out today. And that's not really what I want to do with my channel. Although, if something happens, like on Paul Vanderklay's channel or something that directly relates to the things that I'm very interested in, I may try to capture some of the attention while it's still fresh. But it would be very easy to just always be jumping on the thing that just happened and not make any real progress towards a goal. You could seem to be accomplishing quite a lot because you could produce a lot of content, and obviously there's a lot of people that do produce quite a bit of content only by reacting to things that are just happening or conversations that have just happened. But that's not really what I want to accomplish. And one of the reasons why this book really piqued my interest was this idea of propaganda is always tied to the latest technology. So in our time, obviously, that relates to social media and new and upcoming things, VR, and whatever the future will hold. And while I think Byrne Power, in his analysis, criticizes the idea of Christians partaking in propaganda in that way. I don't think that the aspect of always using the new technology is wrong, because you will have no audience otherwise. But I think the distinction is that the messaging must be clear enough, and it must be designed in such a way to use the technology to meet the people where they are. You're not going to reach anybody with a newspaper today. So you need to be where the people are. But then your message has to communicate in such a way that causes them to step back, to snap out of it. And the really interesting kind of other dimension that I have been thinking about in this past week is this idea of BS, as I will say in youth-friendly ways. But John Vervaeke, did this really excellent explanation of that the wisdom of Socrates is that he saw that everybody else was participating in this collective BS, and it was basically convenient lies that everybody has agreed upon because it's very expedient and it allows them to achieve progress towards a goal that they're interested in.
One thing you might say is, well, Socrates is just a skeptic. He's trying to show people that they don't know anything because he wants to show that the gods are right, that nobody has any wisdom, etc. That's too simple. I think something more sophisticated is going on with Socrates, right? Socrates is trying to get you to realize, he's like incarnating the axial revolution. He's trying to get you to realize how much each one of us, myself included, how much we're putting ourselves all the time. Why? Because we pursue things. We find things salient to us. Their happiness, fame, it's salient to us, and we're pursuing it. We're putting our efforts into it way before we understand it, way before we grasp the truths of it. We are always making ourselves susceptible to bullshit because we are being driven by powerful motivations that are salient to us, that are greatly in excess of our understanding of their truth or reality. We are always, all of us, bullshitting ourselves.
Taking these kind of different parts of the puzzle, the idea of propaganda, the idea of BS, and obviously we could apply them in many ways to our current situation, but to engage always in the timely fashion of things is to be working in the realm of propaganda, and the consequence of that is that it's forgettable, which is good if you are using propaganda that is a bunch of BS and you're trying to just convince people to get all outraged about a thing that's happening right now and there's no substance there, so you want them to forget about it. And I think you probably think of lots of news stories where after months-long investigation, we find out that this or that claim that somebody made ended up being false, or there wasn't the substantive story there that it seemed to be. But it doesn't matter because all of the effects of it and the reaction of it was happening at the moment. And so that way, it doesn't matter if it turns out to be false later on. Nobody cares if a New York Times issues a retractment. The damage has been done by them printing a false article in the first place. And, all the blow up that happens from that. So while propaganda is happening, and a lot of it is about spreading this BS, and it's something that collectively as a society we all want to believe in because it allows us to achieve goals and feel good about ourselves and all that. I think that we need to look further back at the roots of these things, which is something that Francis Schaeffer does, which I am a big fan of his, and I've been interspersing clips from his series into some of these videos where I think they're pertinent, just because I think it's so interesting to see that somebody had these ideas in the 70s and they are so relevant to what's happening today. And that really cuts through some of this idea that, like, this is all a new thing and it's happening right now and we have to react right now because, you know, there's no surprising things that happen in the world. Everything has been in the can for days, weeks, months, years, and just the little details get tweaked as things come out. But there's no surprises, really. And so, you know, we can step back and then we get into this conspiratorial mindset. And as Schaeffer admitted, there are some folks that are, you know, meeting in dark rooms and smoking their pipes and planning how they can manipulate markets and political arenas and things for their benefits. He was pretty convinced that Aldous and Julian Huxley were that. But, you know, and they come from a long line. Thomas Henry Huxley, the propaganda artist who really sold Darwinism to the world, was their grandfather or great-grandfather. And, you know, so these things go back in time. But what really piqued my interest was this. I mentioned Michael Heiser. He's very popular right now. His book, The Unseen Realm, is great. Everything that he's doing is great. He's bringing more awareness of the supernatural interpretation of Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, which, you know, really brings to the fore the question of supernatural evil and what role do demons play in our world. And, you know, it's not the cartoon devils with the little red horns, but, you know, the idea that there are invisible forces who have the ability to communicate with us, probably in ways that are subtle enough and close enough to our own thinking that we just assume it comes from our own mind. And yet, either destructive ideas come in. As an example, in the book Talking to Strangers, Malcolm Gladwell has this interesting chapter where he talks about how there continue to be kind of pandemics of suicide. One of them centered around a certain time in England where the type of gas that they were using to heat homes and to cook with was very toxic. And people knew this, and suicides were very common, where people were basically sticking their head in the oven with the gas turned up, and they would suffocate and die. And when they changed it to a less toxic form of gas that wouldn't really have that effect, suicides dropped off. And a similar thing happened before they had installed railings on the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. Many people would go to the bridge, jump off to commit suicide. And then when they put the railings up, the suicides dropped way down, because it was very hard to do, to jump off the bridge at that point. And they had put off investing in the railings because their thinking was, if people want to kill themselves, it's because they're predisposed to that. They have depression, they have some sort of a mental illness, and they're going to find a way to kill themselves regardless of how easy or difficult it is. But that's really not the case. When it was easy for people to kill themselves, they killed themselves a lot more. They attempted suicide when they knew it was easy. But when it was very difficult, they didn't even attempt it. And in my mind, I think that we probably have all experienced a thought that comes into our mind that seems absurd and out of the normal. And actually, Jordan Peterson mentions a circumstance in his book Maps of Meaning, which I haven't really dived in to do the deep dive on the actual book, but I do remember from the introduction, he tells a story about how he's sitting at class one day as a, college student or high school or whatever it was, and he had this urge to stab the guy in front of him with a pen. And there was no rational reason, why would you do that? That's such a crazy thought. And this thought popped into his head. And that was kind of a really important moment for him. And it helped him start to explore this idea of, where does evil come from? And of course, as a psychologist and a materialist, and, at least to this point, mostly living in the modernist material frame, his explanation was all that it must be within the mind of man. And certainly human beings are evil. But what if those particularly bad ideas do not necessarily originate from ourselves, but they come from an external force? To me, that seems very likely. And when we try to determine, what is the role of demons in the real world? Well, I think low-level demons, which according to Heiser would be the ghosts of dead giants, Nephilim, they're just wanton, destructive, chaotic forces. And they're just, when they get the opportunity to whisper into your ear, they're going to say, just crash your car into that wall over there, or jump off this bridge, or stick your head in the oven. And to a healthy person, you just say, what? Where did that thought come from? That's so bizarre. I have no desire to harm myself. But to someone who is in a less stable place, that external push and knowing that the circumstances are there where it is possible, and especially, I think, because we do fear pain, and if there's the idea that this is going to be a painless thing, it's going to be easy, then it becomes, this perfect storm where you could get somebody who would not normally have any desire to kill themselves, but with those circumstances, they choose to make that decision, and the results are tragic. So, how does this connect to propaganda? Well, a lot of Heiser's reasoning for, his interpretation of the Bible comes from this historical, ancient Near East approach to studying the scriptures. And this is also what is popular, John Walton, as I talked about, and several others. And basically, it's this idea when we read the Bible in English, it translates God as God, and everything else that, is some sort of a foreign idol, it's gods with a little g, and, our framework has led us to believe they're false gods. They're not even that they're false gods, they're not gods at all. And saying they worshipped an idol made out of wood or stone, like this little statue, and being clearly that's not a god. And I think that many Christians and pastors have been content to believe and teach and kind of go through this thing of like, well, it was very convenient to worship a god that's a little statue because that god's not going to tell you don't do this. They'll let you do whatever you want. And so in that way, it was a very BS kind of thing that the people were spreading to each other. Like, hey, if we all just believe that the gods are just these sex-crazed, fake imaginary things, and we just say that it's this little statue, we can do whatever we want. And that's somewhat believable. But what Heiser's pointing out is that, no. The people in the first century they weren't just kidding themselves and thinking like, oh, we're going to worship these fake gods and these fake idols, and if we go worship this fake idol, we get to do whatever we want. They thought that they were real, or they were real. And obviously the idea that, oh, when they were worshiping false gods, they were really worshiping demons. Paul states that clearly. But I think, what he's saying is we underestimate how much real demons were having some sort of real influence. And beyond that, it's not just these crazy, wanton, destructive spirits that tell people to kill themselves, but there are more intelligent beings, and that these are these gods of the nations, the gods of ancient Egypt and all this. And that, so basically, yeah, these are real gods. And he gets into this whole thing of at the Tower of Babel, God sent angels or whatever basically to drive all the people their separate ways as their languages are split, and those powers were in charge of the nations, and then over time they became corrupt and people started worshiping them, and then that's where you get all these different gods, Baal and Molech and Ashtoreth and all this. So, and that's all great. It makes tons of sense. The thing is that it's not really unique, because it's basically what secular scholarship has been saying for a long time. But they were saying, oh, the Israelites worshipped all of these idols, and Yahweh was just one of them as well. Because they don't believe God is real, so they don't know how to make any distinction between real gods and false gods. And that's why they have all this dumb nonsense about the documentary hypothesis and how everybody was taking their little religions and mushing them together into this thing, and that's what turns into the Bible, which is not a very good theory. It's a BS theory about how the Bible formed. And so, what he was saying is not necessarily unique. The unique thing about Michael Heiser is that he's taking this stuff, he's removing the fact that it has been used as an attack on the legitimacy of the true God of Israel, and he's reframing the context. And he's trying to do it in the way that somebody would understand it from ancient times. Now, here's where I get to the problem with it. He's saying we can't interpret the Bible according to our creeds or our traditions or anything that. We must interpret it as it was originally, in its original context, as written by the human authors at the time. And that's fine if you are writing a paper for Bible college or for seminary. Yes, those are the rules that you must follow, because that is what you need to do to be technically correct in your assertions. But as a practicing Christian in the 21st century, the idea that the Bible only means what it meant 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago in that particular context, and all of this new stuff that's come along since is all wrong because it's not historical, is absurd. Because if the Bible is true, and God is real, and the Holy Spirit is real, and Jesus is real, then it is an eternal message. And while the historical context is very important and can shed light, it's not designed, it shouldn't be a handcuff to us using the Bible and applying what it has to say to our circumstances and situations today. And in that way, I feel like a lot of the ancient Near Eastern scholars John Walton, and who is a Christian, but I just have beef with his association with biologos, and many other secular authors, like they're they live in this world of biblical interpretation, and which they have to follow all their little academic rules. They can't make statements about theology and its application to people today. Dr. Heiser actually does quite a good job, I think, and his goal, what he really is trying to do is get average people in regular churches to look a little bit closer at their Bible, to dig a little deeper. Now, here's where I have the problem. If we say that these gods, these foreign gods, are real, and we are using the source material from areas around the Bible area, Sumeria, Acadia, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Babylon, and we're taking their sacred texts and we're using those as context to explain the Hebrew scriptures, I think we need to be really careful. Not to say that we can't learn, oh yes, this is how people thought about some of these things. But if we actually believe that those gods were real intelligent beings, then we can't say the Bible is inspired and these books were false. Then we're doing the same thing to those texts that we did to the little statue. And we're saying oh, the little statue is just a convenient thing that they all believed in, and it let them do whatever they want. And we're saying oh, the Bible is this real book, but these other books are just man-made things. Well, if the other books are just man-made things, then you're getting into a real problem with your attempt to defend the Bible as a supernaturally inspired work, because it isn't that drastically different. It is drastically different in very significant ways, but it does bear a lot of resemblance to these other texts. And so I don't think we should say the Bible is less inspired. I think what we should actually do is look at these other texts, the Enuma Elish and all these different things, and all of the Egyptian mythologies, and even the Greek mythologies, about the Greek gods, and we should say those are also inspired. They're inspired by intelligent spiritual forces, but not the true God who loves. And I think that it's interesting because if we look at the ways that those texts differ, it's about some key areas. How the earth was created. Many times it involves there was a really big god and some other and another god, and they fought and they died, and then they used the body of this god to make the world. And that's how they make the world. So what are you telling your people? Don't search beyond this God now. Yeah, he didn't make the world, but the God that made the world is dead and gone. So don't bother trying to reach him or worship him. And then, that's a common theme in a lot of these things. And then the nature of man. Man is, created as a slave of the god, to serve the gods. So, it puts man in a low status. It's an oppressive message. And so really, I think if we look back, these other ancient texts are forms of propaganda, divinely inspired, not by the one true God, but by intelligent, evil beings to suppress and to manage and to keep people down. And there's even a geographical suppressive element to these texts where, it was all about how our nation is the real people, and this is the center of the world, and all the other people are outsiders, and we should kill them, or they're inferior, or whatever. And so, so that's a big part about why I wanted to study this, because if we're going to interpret the Bible through the lens of these other ancient texts, we have to realize that they are ancient propaganda. And that doesn't mean we should just run away from it and don't read it because it's going to warp our minds. I don't think that's true. But I think we need to be aware of why those subtle differences are critical to our understanding. And that brings me to this kind of convergence between those texts and the way that people are interpreting them and how they're using that to interpret the Bible. And then when we get to like Darwinism and the idea of evolution, because it's integral, because the thing is that you'll say this all the time, that you'll hear this all the time, that, well, the ancient people, when they read these creation accounts like Genesis, it wasn't about material creation of the world. It was about some symbolic thing. Well, that was the convenient propaganda then, and it's convenient propaganda now, because it does matter how the world came about into existence, how man was created. And even the Israelites, they didn't, even if they did understand it in this sort of wacky way, that not to say that there aren't symbolic interpretations, and I do appreciate the work of people like Jonathan Peugeot, but it's not just symbolic. It's symbolic because it's rituals that were made to preserve real events, and then over time those real events become this symbolic thing. Now, despite what they say, I am pretty certain that if you observe the Eucharist ceremony in a Eastern Orthodox church today, it is not exactly like how it was on the Last Supper when Jesus was passing it out. Because over the centuries, more and more symbolic meaning has been added on top of those events. And so now there's a much more ritualistic way of doing it. Nobody's getting drunk in the Eastern Orthodox Church, but they were in the church in Corinth. So there was considerably more access and less ritual in the eating and drinking of the bread and the wine in the ancient times. And that's just pretty straightforward. It's not to say that whatever, all the things that happen now are not significant. I don't believe that. I think they are. But we have to understand that things, real things happen first, and then they gain significance and symbolic significance over time as we try to preserve them. Because in the mind of the first person, it was important because it was a life-changing event. Like if you think about like this idea of the fall, whatever happened there with Adam and Eve, and I do plan to kind of dive deep into that at some point. It meant way more to them than it did to their children. But what their children knew is that their parents said, it's really important that we remember this. We really have to remember this story. And somewhere along the way, people stopped asking, why is this story so important? They stopped asking more specific details. And so then the more specific details are lost. And we have to just, we can use our imagination to figure it out, but we don't know for sure. So then when we get to the time of Darwin, the original ideas of Darwin are don't stand up today. Now people have embraced his basic assumptions, and then like all the science that's been done since his theory became the mainstream have basically added layers and layers and layers of confirmation bias through all sorts of changes of technology and all sorts of refuted things. At the time of Darwin, they didn't know about DNA. They didn't even really know about the cell. They thought that, in the cell was just full of cytoplasm, and they didn't know what that was. They had no idea about the complexity of these little machines that are in cells. And, like the micromotor elements of single-celled organisms. And then even beyond that, when we get to this thing, those videos of the DNA where it's unraveling and recombining and like that level of complexity is, if somebody showed Darwin that, the week after the Origin of Species came out, he would have said, no, yeah, that this doesn't explain that, but because so anyway, if you look at the way that the rapid adoption of Darwinism, which, like I said, Thomas Henry Huxley is largely responsible for, Darwin's bulldog as he's known, and he actually thought it was somewhat of a weak theory, but he saw the usefulness of it because it would allow people to do whatever they want, and it would take a large authority over life away from the church and religion and the Bible, and would put it in the hands of rational scientific men who could be the new creators of society. And I think it's a direct line, if you look, from the adoption of those ideas to Karl Marx and to the fascists and Nazis, and it's just a straight line of reasoning. And so when I look at that situation, I see that it was a BS idea. It was a very convenient lie to accomplish a goal. And to me, the evidence of a supernatural intelligence pushing that idea along is there. And so that's why I say, to say that these other documents are the reason why we can't use Genesis as some sort of a explanation about how the world was actually created is to basically fall for the very lie that those other documents were created to introduce. And then Darwinism is just the most recent version of that. And I think, there's other things too, like Manichaeism, when you see the way that rised up, and, it had its little period of success, and then it kind of faded away. And, it didn't work that well. But there were some ideas that were useful. Somebody was listening. Somebody was remembering things. Because Manny said that he was the final prophet. He said he was the final prophet after Jesus came. I'm the final prophet. There's nobody coming after me. Of course, somebody else came along after him who also said that they were the final prophet. And there's a lot of people arguing still that Muhammad was the final prophet. And, when we look at the nature of the Quran and the teachings of Islam, it's as if somebody said, the Bible is very powerful, but we need to tweak it so that we have more control over people. And they applied a lot of the principles that are found in this book in the ways that it differs from the Bible. The thing of it, only being acceptable if it's read in Arabic. Any translation is an interpretation. Because those beings are not the masters of language the way that God is. And the fact that the Hebrew Bible, it can be translated into 100 languages, and the effects of it are almost the same in the lives of the people reading it. I think that's a very powerful thing to consider. So this is got to wrap this up here, but these are the ideas that I'm kind of looking at, and so I want to see these principles. Are very apparent in what's happening today, but I think that if we break them down into their most basic kind of concepts and ideas, we can see that the ideas have been in effect for a very, 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 very long time. I would say from the moment that snake whispered in the woman's ears, that was the first propaganda message. And we've been susceptible to that ever since then, and we've been falling for it.